12 years old, midnight, a prescription bottle so empty it rattled like a dead man's last breath. That's what Kellen Mercer carried when he climbed onto his beaten BMX and pedaled into the frozen dark. Not toward safety, not toward anyone who was supposed to help, but toward the most dangerous address in Harlow County. Toward men with scars deeper than their tattoos and reputations that made grown adults cross the street. He had tried the hospital. He had tried the neighbor. He had tried the school counselor's emergency line and listened to it ring 17 times into silence. When every system built to protect children had failed a 12-year-old boy, he made a map with his own hands and rode toward the sound of Harley engines. Because sometimes the only people left who answer in the dark are the ones the daylight world already gave up on. If this story hits something real inside you, stay with it until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where in this world people are still listening for each other at midnight. Underscore, 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 underscore. The cold came in off the ridge like something personal. It pushed through the gaps in Kellen Mercer's jacket, a hand-me-down Carhartt 2 sizes too big, the zipper broken at the bottom, the cuffs frayed to string, and settled against his ribs like a second skin made of ice. His breath came out in hard white puffs. The BMX beneath him was older than he was, the chain skipping every third rotation with a sound like a broken clock, the handlebars wrapped in electrical tape that had started to peel in the cold. He rode with one hand on the grip and one hand pressed against his jacket pocket, fingers closed around the orange prescription bottle, as if releasing it would mean releasing something he wasn't ready to name. Harlow was the kind of town that looked fine from the highway. A water tower, a feed store, a diner with a pie display in the window, and a flag out front. The kind of town politicians photographed themselves in front of during election years, talking about the backbone of America. What the photographs never captured was the hollowed-out mill district in the northeast corner, where 3 consecutive winters had killed employment and left behind a grid of dark windows and overgrown lots, and men who had come home from places overseas with parts of themselves missing that no doctor could stitch back. What the photographs never showed was Caldwell Street at midnight, where the streetlights flickered in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if even the infrastructure had given up trying. Kellen had lived on Caldwell Street his entire life. He knew which boards on the porch steps creaked. He knew the smell of the house at different hours, coffee in the early morning before his father's insomnia surrendered to exhaustion, motor oil, an old newspaper in the afternoon, something quieter and more frightening in the evenings when the lights stayed off longer than they should have. He knew the sound of his father's breathing through the bedroom wall. He'd been cataloging it for months without fully understanding why. The way a child's instincts absorb danger before the child's mind can articulate what danger means. Tonight, the breathing had changed. He didn't let himself think too hard about what that meant. Thinking too hard had a way of making his legs stop working, and his legs needed to keep working. He pedaled harder into the wind, the map in his other jacket pocket, the one his homeroom teacher missed. Pruitt had drawn on the back of a detention slip 3 weeks ago, half joking, half warning, when he'd asked her what was on the north end of Fletcher Road, had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were turning soft. Black Wolves MC. Don't go there, Kellen. I mean it. She had underlined don't twice. He had memorized the route anyway, the way he memorized everything that might someday be useful, and now the map lived in his muscle memory more than his pocket. Left on Garfield, right past the salvage yard, follow the sound. He heard them before he saw them. The low idle of multiple Harley-Davidsons was a sound that carried differently than anything else in Harlow's nighttime silence. It wasn't loud, exactly. At idle, the engine spoke at a frequency closer to a warning than a roar. But it had weight. It pushed the air differently. Kellen felt it in his sternum before his ears fully processed it, and he followed that feeling around the last curve of Fletcher Road and stopped pedaling. The Black Wolves Motorcycle Club occupied what had once been a transmission repair shop, a long, low building of corrugated metal and old brick, The kind of structure that had absorbed decades of oil and exhaust and argument until it smelled permanently of all three. The forecourt was gravel. Half a dozen Harleys sat in a loose formation beneath a sodium vapor lamp that cast everything in a color between orange and rust. A hand-painted sign above the roll-up door read Black Wolves Emic Harlow Chapter, the lettering uneven but deliberate, the kind of lettering done by someone who took pride in the doing, even if not in the result. 3 men stood outside. One was enormous, broad through the shoulders, a beard going gray at the edges, arms that had been built by decades of physical work and kept by whatever had replaced the work. Another was leaning against the wall with a cigarette, thin-faced, watchful, the kind of stillness that came from practice. The third was standing apart from both of them, facing the road, as if he'd been expecting someone, even if he hadn't known who. This third man was Ridge Calloway. Kellen knew the name. Everyone in Harlow knew the name, the way they knew the names of things that were powerful and potentially dangerous and better respected than dismissed. Ridge Calloway was 51 years old, though he carried the years differently than most men that age. Not softened by them, but compacted, the way old wood gets harder as it dries. He had a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, an old one, pale and permanent. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples. He wore a cut over a flannel shirt, the Black Wolves patch centered on the back, and he stood with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to be very careful about what he let his body communicate. His eyes, when they found Kellen at the edge of the gravel lot, were not what Kellen expected. He had expected dismissal, maybe amusement, possibly the kind of controlled threat that adults who wanted to be left alone deployed automatically against children who showed up uninvited at midnight. He had prepared for all of those. He had a small speech rehearsed, 3 sentences, the key information compressed to the minimum, because he understood instinctively that people like these would respect efficiency over emotion. What he hadn't prepared for was the way Ridge Calloway looked at him and immediately went quiet in a different way, the way a man goes quiet when he recognizes something. Ridge walked to the edge of the gravel, stopped, crouched slightly so they were closer to the same height, which was a thing adults almost never did, and which Kellen noted without knowing what to do with. "You lost, kid." Kellen's prepared speech dissolved. What came out instead were the 5 words he hadn't planned. "Please keep my dad awake." The cigarette behind Ridge stopped moving. The big man with the gray beard turned slowly. The night seemed to compress around the gravel lot, the Harley engines idling like held breath. Ridge Calloway looked at the empty prescription bottle visible at the edge of Kellen's jacket pocket. He looked at the boy's face, the dry eyes that were somehow worse than crying, the locked jaw, the particular blankness that wasn't calm, but was the thing that sits on top of panic when panic has been held in place too long. He looked at all of that in less than 2 seconds, and Kellen watched something move through the man's expression that he couldn't name but would think about for years afterward. "Where do you live?" Ridge said. It wasn't a question. Kellen pulled out the map. Underscore, 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 underscore. There were 7 of them when they turned onto Caldwell Street. Engines dropped to near silence, rolling slow enough that the neighbors might hear only the low mechanical purr and assume it was a single truck passing. Ridge led. Behind him came the big man, Decker, Kellen would learn, sergeant at arms, 22 years with the club, 8 before that with the Army, and behind him the thin, watchful man named Cole, and 4 others whose names Kellen collected later like objects he needed to keep safe. They didn't roar down the street with theater. They came quietly, which was somehow more serious. The house on Caldwell Street was a rental, white vinyl siding gone gray with 2 winters of neglect, the front porch sagging on the right side where a support post had rotted at the base. A single light burned in the kitchen. The rest of the house was dark. Ridge parked at the curb and sat for a moment with his hands on his thighs, looking at the house. Then he looked at Kellen, who had pedaled ahead and was standing on the sidewalk with his bicycle between his legs, hands on the handlebars, watching Ridge the way you watch someone you've given something breakable to. He know you left? Kellen shook his head. How long ago did you find the bottle? Hour, maybe more. I called the crisis line. A pause. They put me on hold. Something moved through Ridge's jaw. He didn't say anything about the crisis line. He got off his bike. Stay here, he said, and then, to the men behind him, Decker. Decker came forward. He was the kind of large that children were generally frightened of, wide enough to block a doorframe, with hands that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts for a larger project. But he positioned himself next to Kellen with a naturalness that managed to communicate, "You're staying with me," without making it feel like a cage. He smelled like motor oil and coffee and the faint chemical ghost of old cigarettes. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. Ridge went to the front door alone. He knocked twice. Not loud, not aggressive. The knock of someone who has thought about what the person on the other side of the door is feeling and has adjusted accordingly. 30 seconds of silence. Then the sound of movement inside, slow, effortful. The kitchen light shifted as a shadow crossed it. The door opened 3 inches on its chain. What Ridge said through those 3 inches, Kellen couldn't hear. He saw the door close, not slam, just close. And he felt his stomach drop before he understood that the chain was being removed, not reinforced, because 30 seconds later the door opened fully and Ridge stepped inside. Decker put a hand on Kellen's shoulder. Not gripping, just present. He's going to be okay, Decker said. His voice was low, the kind of voice that had learned to be quiet in places where quiet mattered. Kellen said nothing. He was holding the empty prescription bottle so tight his knuckles had gone white in the orange streetlight. How long has it been like this? Decker asked. Since he came home. Kellen paused. From the second one. Decker made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a word. He looked at the house for a long moment. Yeah, he said finally. I know what that looks like. Underscore, 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 underscore. Gavin Mercer was 38 years old and looked closer to 50. He was sitting at the kitchen table when Ridge came in, still in the clothes he'd worn the previous day, a cup of cold coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was a big man who had gotten smaller. You could see it in the way his shoulders sat, the way his shirt hung on him. He'd been built for physical work and had the hands to prove it. Mechanic's hands. The kind with permanent grease in the creases that no amount of soap fully removed. His face was the face of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had recently put it down not because the weight was gone, but because his arms had simply given out. He looked at Ridge Calloway standing in his kitchen without visible surprise. Maybe he was past surprise. Maybe he recognized something too. He looked at the Black Wolf's cut. My kid called you. Your kid rode his bicycle 1.5 miles in below freezing temperatures to ask for help, Ridge said, in the dark, alone, because he's been watching you for months and he was out of other options. He pulled out the chair across from Gavin and sat in it. That boy is the bravest person I've met in a long time, and I've met some brave people. Gavin looked at the cold coffee. His throat moved. I wasn't going to... He stopped, started again. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I know, Ridge said. You don't know me. No, but I know that look. He said it without inflection, without the particular gentleness that sometimes makes things worse. Just flat acknowledgement, one man to another. And I know that bottle wasn't empty this morning. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, engines idled at a frequency that had started to feel, to Kellen on the sidewalk, like a heartbeat. Gavin put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. He made a sound that was worse than crying. The sound of something structural giving way. The sound beneath crying. The sound a man makes when he's been holding himself together through pure muscular effort, and the muscles have finally, after months, stopped responding. Ridge didn't move toward him, didn't put a hand on his shoulder, didn't offer words. He sat across the table and let it happen and didn't look away, which turned out to be the most important thing. After a while, the sound stopped. Gavin lowered his hands. His eyes were dry and red. "The bills," he said. "I can't—" He shook his head. "I can't make the numbers work. I've tried every way I know how to make the numbers work, and they don't. And Kellen needs—" His voice caught. "He needs things. He's supposed to need things. He's 12. He needs his dad," Ridge said. Gavin pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I'm not much of one right now." "You're the only one he's got," Ridge said. "And he just rode a bicycle in the dark to make sure you were still here. That's not nothing. That's everything." Underscore, 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 underscore. Cole appeared at the back of the house sometime after 1 in the morning, having done a quiet perimeter check that Kellen only learned about later, and settled himself on the back steps with a thermos of coffee and a cigarette he didn't light. Just held, the way some men hold things that used to be habits and are now just something to do with their hands. Decker remained with Kellen on the sidewalk until Ridge appeared at the front door and made a small gesture. "Come in. It's okay." And Kellen walked up the porch steps with his bicycle and leaned it against the railing and went inside. Gavin was still at the kitchen table. He looked at his son in the doorway, and something moved through his face that was complicated and unresolved and probably couldn't be named in a single word in any language. Kellen looked back at his father and said nothing, which was right, because there was nothing to say yet, only the fact of each other, only the fact that they were both still in the same room. Ridge stood, quietly, and moved to the counter and without being asked began making a fresh pot of coffee. Outside, another Harley rolled slowly onto Caldwell Street. Then another. Not gathering, just present, just there. The engines idled and then cut, one after another, and the street settled into a silence that felt different from the silence that had been there before. Fuller, somehow, like the dark had been given company. Kellen sat down next to his father. Their shoulders were almost touching. "I drew a map," Kellen said, "to find them." Gavin looked at him. His voice came out rough and low and careful. "I know, bud. I didn't know what else to do. You did the right thing." Gavin's voice cracked in the middle of it. He steadied it. "You did exactly the right thing." Ridge set 2 mugs of coffee on the table. He set a third near the edge for himself and pulled a chair slightly back from the table, giving them space, present but not intrusive. Outside, boots scraped softly on old wooden porch steps, the sound of leather, the smell of the cold. Kellen reached into his jacket pocket and placed the empty prescription bottle on the table between them. Neither of them looked at it directly, but it stayed there, visible, where it couldn't be avoided, because Kellen had understood, with the instincts of a child who had been watching too closely for too long, that some things needed to be in the open, even when nobody was ready to talk about them yet. Ridge looked at the boy, and then at the man, and then out the window at the dark street where his brothers sat in the cold, not leaving. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He didn't say anything, which was how the first night of the watch began. Not with declarations, not with plans, but with 3 people in a kitchen and the sound of Harleys idling outside like a promise nobody had made yet in words. Only in the simple, undeniable fact of showing up. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, Kellen fell asleep in his chair with his head tilted against his father's shoulder. Gavin didn't move. He sat completely still with the boy's weight against him and stared at the kitchen wall and breathed, deliberately, carefully, the way you breathe when you are reminding yourself that breathing is something you're choosing to keep doing. Ridge watched that, too. And sometime around 3, when Gavin's eyes finally started to close and his breathing evened out into something approaching sleep, Ridge slipped out the back door and stood on the steps in the cold and looked up at the sky for a long moment. Cole was still there, on the lower step, thermos in hand, not sleeping. "Same," Cole said without being asked. Ridge looked at him. "All of us," Cole said quietly. "Same look, different address." Ridge said nothing. He looked at the sky, which had cleared, and the stars were very sharp and very cold and very far away. And somewhere on the street in front of the house, a Harley engine turned over softly in the dark like something keeping time. He went back inside. He refilled the coffee. He sat back down at the table across from the sleeping father and the sleeping boy and the empty orange bottle, and he did not leave. When dawn started to gray the kitchen windows, Ridge was still there. And something else was there now, too. Something that hadn't been there at midnight. Not safety, not yet. Not resolution. But the first faint edge of the possibility of it, fragile as early light, no more substantial than the steam rising off a cooling mug of coffee in a broken-down kitchen on a street that the rest of the world had already forgotten. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. But then Ridge's phone buzzed on the table, face down, and when he turned it over and read the message, the quiet in his expression disappeared. His jaw set. His eyes went to the window. Cole was already awake, watching him. What? Ridge set the phone back down. He looked at Gavin Mercer's sleeping face, the deep lines, the veteran's hollowness, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting invisible wars in a body that lost count of which enemy was which. He looked at Kellen, the boy who rode through the dark to save his father with nothing but a hand-drawn map and 5 words and more courage than most adults Ridge had known. Then he stood up slowly, the chair barely scraping, and jerked his head toward the door. Cole followed him outside into the gray morning, and Ridge held the phone up so Cole could read the message. 3 words. A name Ridge recognized. A name that changed everything about what kind of night this had actually been. And why Gavin Mercer's debt, the debt Ridge had just seen in black and white on that glowing screen, was not the kind you paid in money. Cole stared at the message. Then he looked up at Ridge. Tell me that's not who I think it is. Ridge pocketed the phone. Start calling the chapter, he said. The gray light through the kitchen window had turned the color of old pewter by the time Ridge came back inside. He moved quietly, the way men move when they've learned that sudden sounds carry weight in houses where people are sleeping badly. He set his phone face down on the counter. He poured the last of the coffee into his mug and stood at the window with it, looking at the street. And his expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Gavin Mercer was still asleep at the kitchen table. His head dropped forward, one hand flat on the wood near the orange prescription bottle. Kellen had slid sideways in his chair until his cheek rested on his folded arms, his breathing slow and even, the particular deepness of a child's sleep that comes after the body has finally decided the immediate emergency is over. His jacket was still on. His sneakers were still tied. Ridge looked at both of them for a long moment before he turned and went back out. Cole was on the porch, arms crossed against the cold, watching the street. 2 other wolves were still out there. Hatch on his bike at the curb, engine off, sitting with the particular stillness of a man who had done a lot of waiting in his life, and Priest on the sidewalk opposite, hands in his pockets, back to a dead elm tree, watching the cross street. Nobody was speaking. Nobody needed to. Talk to me, Cole said low. Ridge leaned against the porch railing. He pulled out the phone and held it so Cole could read the message again in the growing light. A name. An amount. 2 words beneath it, overdue since August. Cole's jaw moved. He looked at the street. Doyle Rennick. Yeah. I thought Rennick was in Pender County. He was, Ridge said. He's not anymore. Cole absorbed that. His hand went to his jacket pocket, came out with a cigarette, didn't light it. He turned it between his fingers. You think Gavin knows? I think Gavin knows exactly what he owes and to who, Ridge said. I think that's part of why he was sitting at that table last night with an empty bottle and the lights off. He pulled the railing, tested it. Old wood, soft in the grain, the post at the end giving slightly when he pressed it. A man can survive a lot of things. Debt to someone like Rennick isn't one of them. Not on your own. How much? Ridge told him. Cole put the unlit cigarette behind his ear. He said something quiet under his breath that wasn't quite a word. Then, when'd that happen? Deployment gap. Between his first and second tour, by the look of it. Rennick's operation runs the short-term loan circuit in the Mill District. The ones that don't show up in any bank database. The ones where you shake hands instead of signing paper. Ridge drank the rest of his coffee. It had gone cold. Gavin comes home the second time and the work's gone. The VA's backed up 4 months on his claims. He's got a 12-year-old kid and a rental he can't make the payment on. And Rennick's the only one returning his calls. Cole looked at the house, at the dark windows and the sagging porch post, and the bicycle leaning against the railing with its frayed handlebars and its skipping chain. He was quiet for a long time. The kid knew none of this, Cole said finally. The kid knew something was wrong, Ridge said. Kids always know something's wrong. They just don't know the shape of it. He went down the porch steps and crossed to where Hatch was sitting his parked Harley at the curb. Hatch was a compact, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a shaved head and a face that had been rearranged more than once and had mostly settled back into a version of itself that worked. He had been with the wolves since before Ridge had. He listened without expression while Ridge gave him the short version, and when Ridge was done, Hatch looked at the house the same way Cole had. Rennick's going to come for the house, Hatch said. He's going to come for whatever Gavin's got, which isn't much, which means if Gavin can't make it right in cash, Rennick finds another way to extract value. Ridge's voice was flat. We've seen how that goes. Hatch said, What do you want to do? And Ridge didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer, because Ridge Calloway was not a man who paused over easy questions. What he wanted to do and what was smart to do were probably the same thing, which was not always the case, and that alignment made him cautious rather than confident. He had a rule, had held to it for over 2 decades of leading the chapter, about not letting the club be driven by reaction, about not letting anger or old history be the engine. He had made exactly 3 exceptions to that rule in 22 years. He looked at the kitchen window, at the silhouette of a sleeping boy visible through the glass. Get Decker, he said. Tell him to bring Nolan. I want eyes on Rennick's operation before we do anything else. He paused, quietly. And Gavin? Gavin doesn't know we know, Ridge said. Not yet. He's got enough weight on him. We let him sleep. Underscore, 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 underscore. Gavin Mercer woke at 7:43 to the smell of fresh coffee and the disorienting fact of a large man he did not know sitting calmly at his kitchen counter reading a folded newspaper. The large man looked up without apparent concern. He had the newspaper folded to the crossword section and a pen in his hand. He said, Morning, coffee's fresh. Gavin sat up slowly, which took effort, every joint complaining in the way that happens when you've slept in a chair after a night of the kind Gavin had survived. He looked around the kitchen. Kellen was gone. The orange bottle was still on the table, but someone had moved it to the edge, near the wall, less center stage. Ridge was not present. The back door was cracked open an inch, letting in cold air and the smell of frost. Where's my son? Gavin said. Not a question. An inventory. Outside with Ridge, the large man said. There's a loose board on your back steps that was bothering Ridge. Your boy's holding the flashlight. He wrote something in the crossword. I'm Decker. Gavin looked at Decker for a moment. You were here last night. I was. You stayed all night. Most of it. Cole took the back 3 hours around 4. Decker set the pen down. Listen, I'm not going to pretend last night wasn't what it was, but I'm also not going to make a production of it over your morning coffee. So why don't you just drink it first? Gavin looked at the coffee. He got up, which was a process, and poured a mug and stood at the counter and drank half of it before he said anything else. He shouldn't have gone to you people. Decker considered that. Maybe not, he said. But he did, and here we are. I don't want... Gavin stopped, started again. I'm not a project. Nobody said you were. I've had people try to help before. The VA, the counselors, the guys from my unit who felt like they owed me something after... He stopped again, the sentence cutting off at a place he wasn't willing to go. He drank the rest of the coffee. They show up for a week. 2 weeks. then life pulls them somewhere else. That's not a complaint. That's just how it works. People have their own problems. Decker looked at him steadily. He didn't rush to fill the silence. We're not people, Decker said finally. Not in the regular sense. You're bikers. We're the guys who didn't fit anywhere else either, Decker said. So we stopped trying to fit and started showing up for each other instead. He picked the pen back up. It's a different thing. Gavin set his mug down. He looked out the window at the backyard, where Ridge was crouched at the base of the porch steps with a piece of lumber and a cordless drill that had appeared from somewhere, and Kellen was standing 3 feet away holding a flashlight pointed at the rotten post, even though it was full daylight now, because Ridge had handed it to him and he was not going to let Ridge down. Something moved across Gavin's face that he immediately controlled. He turned away from the window. I need to know something, he said. Decker waited. Last night, Ridge came in here and Gavin pressed his thumb into the heel of his hand. He sat across from me and he didn't flinch. He didn't call anyone. He didn't start making noise about hospitals or intervention or any of that. He looked at Decker. Why? Decker was quiet for a moment. He set the newspaper down. Because Ridge has sat on his own side of that table, he said carefully. Different kitchen, long time ago. And nobody came. He paused. So now he comes. The kitchen was very still. I didn't know that, Gavin said. Not a lot of people do, Decker said. Ridge doesn't advertise it, but he told me once. He said the reason he runs this chapter the way he does is because he knows exactly what it costs when nobody shows up. Down to the cent. He picked the newspaper back up. Drink your coffee, Gavin. The board'll be fixed in 10 minutes, and then your kid's gonna come inside starving, and you're gonna need to figure out what's in your fridge. Underscore, 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 underscore. What was in the fridge was not much. Half a carton of eggs, a block of cheese going hard at the corner, the end of a loaf of bread that was still good if you moved fast. Gavin stood in front of it for a moment with the door open and then made eggs without comment, and Kellen came in from the back with pink cheeks and motor oil on his jacket sleeve and sat at the table and ate without ceremony, the appetite of a 12-year-old who hadn't eaten since school the previous day, working its way through everything on the plate. Ridge came in last. He washed his hands at the sink and accepted a mug of coffee from Gavin without comment and sat in the chair he'd occupied the night before, which no one had formally assigned to him but which had somehow already become his. Gavin put the pan in the sink. He turned around and leaned against the counter and crossed his arms and looked at Ridge. I need to know what you know, Gavin said. The room shifted. Kellen looked up from his plate. Decker, behind his newspaper, went still. Ridge set his mug down. He met Gavin's eyes directly. What makes you think I know something? Because you've been in my kitchen for 8 hours and you came back inside with a different face than the one you left with. Gavin's voice was level. I spent 2 years reading men's faces in conditions where getting it wrong had permanent consequences. So, what do you know? Ridge looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Kellen. Kellen was watching his father with the focus of a child who had learned that the spaces between words were often where the important information lived. His fork was in his hand, but he'd stopped eating. Kellen, Decker said very naturally, you want to see the garage over on Fletcher? We've got a '68 Sportster we've been rebuilding since March. Cole would show you. Kellen looked at his father. Gavin gave him the smallest nod. Kellen put his fork down, got up, and followed Decker out the back door without argument, which told Ridge more about the boy's understanding of adult situations than almost anything else could have. When the door closed, Gavin said, Rennick. Ridge held his expression. You know about the message. I know Rennick's been in Harlow County for 3 weeks, Gavin said. I know because he sent someone to this address 6 days ago. A kid, maybe 20, driving a beige Camry. He sat outside for 20 minutes and then left. He pressed his thumb into his palm again, hard. I've been waiting for the follow-up. How much? Ridge said. Gavin looked at the window. $14,600 and interest. From when? Between deployments, I needed... He stopped. I needed to fix the furnace before Kellen and I moved in. The VA hadn't processed the first claim. The bank turned me down because my credit was... He shook his head. Rennick's guy found me at the diner. Said it was simple, short-term. Said Rennick was a businessman, not a collector. A short, hard sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Right. Ridge was quiet for a moment. Outside, distantly, the sound of a Harley starting up on Fletcher Road. Someone heading out, or heading somewhere specific. When he sent the kid to your address, Ridge said, did he leave anything? Gavin's jaw tightened. He went to the counter drawer and opened it and took out an envelope and set it on the table between them. Ridge picked it up. He read the contents. A single handwritten page, no letterhead. The arithmetic clear, and the language below it clearer. And set it back down. He's not coming for money, Ridge said. No. He's coming for the lease. The house has 18 months left on a 6-year rental agreement, Gavin said. Rennick owns the property company that owns this rental. I found out 2 months ago. By then it was already... He pressed both hands flat on the counter. It was already what it was. Ridge looked at the envelope. He thought about Kellen on his bicycle in the dark, the frayed handlebars, the map drawn on a detention slip. He thought about the empty bottle. He thought about the particular geometry of a trap where every door a man tries turns out to open onto another wall. Why didn't you go to anyone? Ridge said. There are services. I went to services. Gavin's voice went quiet and hard in a way that meant he was being careful not to let it get louder. I sat in a waiting room for 4 hours with a number on a paper. I talked to a caseworker who was handling 3 times her caseload, who listened to me for 12 minutes and told me to call back in 30 days for a follow-up appointment. I went to the Veterans Resource Center, and they referred me to the county financial counselor who referred me back to the VA. I went to the VA, and they lost my file. He picked the envelope up and put it back in the drawer and closed it with more force than he'd intended. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm telling you, the map doesn't connect. The system... He stopped. His throat worked. There are good people in it. I know that, but the map doesn't connect. Ridge said nothing for a moment. He turned his coffee mug on the table, a slow rotation, his eyes on it. We're going to need you to trust us, he said finally. I don't know you. I know. That's not... Gavin pushed off the counter. That's not enough. I'm not going to let Kellen get attached to something that... He gestured at the window, at the street, at the general direction of everything Ridge represented. You people live by a different set of rules. I've got a kid. Your kid rode to us, Ridge said, not away. Gavin stood still. His chest moved with a slow, controlled breath. I need more than one night, he said. I know that too, Ridge said. I'm not asking for trust by tomorrow morning. I'm asking you to let us come back tonight, and the night after, and we'll see how the map looks after a few weeks. He picked up his mug. Nobody's taking anything from you. Nobody's running your life. We're just... He paused, searched for the word, and didn't find a clean one. We're just going to be on the porch. The kitchen held the silence for a long moment. Gavin looked at the drawer where the envelope was. He looked at the window. Then he looked at Ridge Calloway. The scar, the gray-edged temples, the eyes that carried weight they'd learned to carry without hunching under it. And he made the calculation that a man makes when the options in front of him have been reduced to very few. I want to know if you move on Rennick, he said. Fair. I mean it. I want to be told, not protected from it. Told. Agreed, Ridge said. He stood. He picked up his cut from the back of the chair and pulled it on, the leather settling into the shape it always held, the patch centered and straight. I'll have someone here by 8 tonight. He went out the front door, and Gavin listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then the sound of a Harley turning over on the street, and then the sound dropping away as it moved toward Fletcher Road, and then the particular quality of silence that comes after an engine disappears. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then he opened the drawer and took the envelope out again and read it again, though he had memorized it weeks ago, as if rereading it might change the arithmetic. It didn't. underscore 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 underscore. The nightly watch became its own kind of institution over the 2 weeks that followed. It was never formal. Nobody announced rotations or drew up schedules that got posted anywhere. Somehow, between 8 in the evening and whenever the gray morning started, there was always someone. Cole, most nights, who had a talent for sitting with a thermos and his own silence that made even the quality of the air on the porch feel less hostile. Hatch twice, who said almost nothing, but who had, apparently in a former life, been a journeyman electrician, and on the second visit fixed the 2 dead outlets in Gavin's kitchen without mentioning he was going to and without presenting a bill. A man named Voss, who was somewhere in his 60s and walked with a cane and had the most extensive knowledge of Korean War history Gavin had ever encountered, and who was awake when Gavin woke at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, and came out to find him, and who talked about Chosin Reservoir in the particular way veterans talk about things they survived by not looking at directly, and who by doing so allowed Gavin to talk around his own things in a way the professional counselors with their direct questions had never quite managed. There were nights when Gavin sat on the porch himself, coffee in hand, jacket over his shoulders, the cold air doing something for his head that the inside of the house couldn't. There were nights when whoever was there said nothing for an hour at a time, and it was all right, because the silence between people who have both decided to stay in it is a different thing entirely from the silence of being alone. Kellen, for his part, was cataloging. It started with a notebook he'd found in his backpack, a composition book, the kind from the school supply list, black and white marbled cover, mostly unused. He'd begun writing down names and dates and times on the inside pages, not for any purpose he could have articulated, just because it felt important to have proof, to have a record that said, these people came. On this night, at this hour, in this cold, they came and they stayed, as if the record might be needed later as evidence of something that would otherwise become unbelievable. He was filling the 3rd page when Ridge came for what had become his own regular slot. Thursday nights, without discussion, showing up around 9 and staying until Cole or Voss arrived to hand off. Kellen showed him the notebook. Ridge looked at it for a long time. He turned the pages slowly. He looked at Kellen's handwriting. Careful, deliberate, the handwriting of a kid who paid attention in school even when school was the least of what was happening in his life. And something in his expression shifted in a way he didn't fully control. This is important, Ridge said. I know, Kellen said. You should keep it somewhere safe. It's in the toolbox, Kellen said, the one in Dad's shop space. He keeps it locked. Ridge handed it back. He sat with his coffee. The porch boards were cold. Somewhere down Caldwell Street, a dog was barking at something. Stopped. Started again. Stopped for good. Can I ask you something? Kellen said. Shoot! Decker said you used to. He stopped, reformulated. Decker said you understand why my dad's like this. Ridge was quiet. Is that because you were like that? Ridge turned the coffee mug in his hands. He looked at the street. His breath came out white in the cold. I was in a place, he said carefully, where I didn't think the numbers added up anymore. Mine, specifically. He paused. That was a long time ago. What changed it? Ridge looked at him. The sodium vapor light across the street painted everything in that orange rust color. Kellen was looking back at him with the direct, undefended attention of a child who had not yet learned to ask questions sideways. Someone came and sat on my porch, Ridge said. Kellen nodded slowly. He looked at the notebook in his hands. He opened to the next blank page and wrote the date and the time and wrote Ridge and set the pen against the page and left it there. Okay, he said. And that might have been a turning point. Might have been the place where the story started moving upward rather than continuing to accumulate dark. Except that the following Tuesday evening, Cole was supposed to be on the porch at 8 and wasn't there at 8 or at 8:30. And when Ridge called him, the phone rang to voicemail. And when he drove past the house on Caldwell Street at 9:15, the porch was empty, and Gavin Mercer was not answering his door. Ridge tried the back. Empty. Kellen's bicycle was gone. He stood in the backyard in the dark and looked at the dead grass and the cracked concrete of the old shed foundation and called Cole again and got voicemail again. And then he called Hatch and said 3 words. Hatch said, "I'll get Decker." Ridge was already moving toward his bike when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He stopped under the amber cone of the back porch light and read it. It was an address, a location out past the salvage yard, past the point where Harlow's failing street lighting gave out and the roads turned to packed gravel between abandoned agricultural buildings. And below the address, 6 words that dissolved every calculation Ridge had been making about patience and trust and letting things develop at their own pace. Bring what you owe or bring him. He read it twice. The him could mean Gavin. The him could mean Kellen. Rennick had never been specific about his leverage because he didn't need to be, because men who understood the arithmetic already knew which variable was being threatened. Ridge put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the empty yard, the dark windows, the bicycle-shaped absence on the side of the house where Kellen always leaned it. He got on his bike. He rode 2 blocks before he realized Cole's car was parked on the side street behind the Mercer house, dark, engine cold, and when Ridge stopped and checked the car, the driver's door was unlocked and Cole's phone was on the passenger seat with the screen cracked and 17 missed calls from Ridge's number lined up like an accusation. And the cold in Ridge's chest that had been quietly growing since he read the message became something solid and specific, because Cole had been on his way to the porch, and something had stopped him before he got there. And whatever had stopped him had left his phone behind, and that was not a thing Cole would do willingly. Ridge started his bike again. His jaw was set. His eyes were flat and very still. He sent a single text to Decker. Cole's car on Mercer Street. Cole's not in it. Then he rode toward the salvage yard and the packed gravel roads beyond it, alone, into a dark he no longer had any certainty about, carrying the knowledge that whatever this had been, a watch, a vigil, a slow, patient building of trust between damaged men, had just become something else entirely, something with harder edges and higher stakes, and that somewhere out past the edge of Harlow's light, a 12-year-old boy with a notebook full of names was in the middle of it. The gravel road past the salvage yard had no name on any map Ridge had ever seen. It existed the way certain things in small towns exist, through collective knowledge rather than official record, the kind of knowledge passed person to person in lowered voices, the kind that doesn't get written down because the people who use it prefer the absence of documentation. Ridge had driven it twice before in his life, both times at night. Both times because someone needed finding. He rode with his headlight cutting a hard white cone through the dark, the gravel popping under his tires in a way that was louder than he wanted, the cold hitting his face at 40 miles an hour with a physical insistence that stripped everything down to the immediate. No rumination, no strategy. Just the road and the engine and the specific tight knowledge that Cole's phone was in his jacket pocket and Cole was somewhere ahead of him, and a 12-year-old boy might be too. He almost missed the turn. A gap in the fence line to the left, barely wide enough for a vehicle, the grass between the tire tracks flattened by recent use. He braked hard, gravel spraying, and swung in. The building materialized at the end of a quarter-mile of track, an old agricultural processing facility, the kind that had been empty for so long its emptiness felt structural, like the emptiness was now holding the building up rather than inhabiting it. Corrugated metal walls bleeding rust. High clerestory windows, most of them broken or boarded. A loading dock on the east side where 2 vehicles were parked, a dark pickup and a sedan with a cracked taillight leaking thin red into the dark. 3 men stood outside the loading dock, not moving, watching him come. Ridge pulled up 20 yards short and killed his engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. He could hear the wind in the fence line. He could hear his own breathing. He looked at the 3 men, and the 3 men looked back at him, and nobody moved for 5 full seconds. Then the loading dock door opened from inside, and Doyle Rennick stepped out into the cold air. Ridge had met Rennick exactly once before, 4 years ago, at a county commissioners' meeting where Rennick had been pressing for a zoning variance on a property development in the East Ward, and Ridge had been there on behalf of 3 families in the Mill District who would be displaced by it. They hadn't spoken directly, They had occupied opposite sides of a room and conducted the negotiation through other people, the way certain men do when they understand that direct engagement would immediately escalate past what the situation officially called for. Ridge had left with the variants blocked. Rennick had left without acknowledgement, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He was a lean man, Rennick, early 50s, with the kind of fitness that was maintained rather than natural, the body of someone who used the gym the way other men used armor. His face was angular and unremarkable except for the eyes, which were light-colored and deeply attentive, the eyes of someone who was always doing arithmetic about everyone in his visual field. He was wearing a coat that cost more than Gavin Mercer's monthly rent, and he had his hands in its pockets, and he looked at Ridge coming off his bike the way a man looks at a scheduled appointment. "Calloway," he said, not a greeting, a confirmation. "Where's Cole?" Ridge said. Rennick tilted his head slightly toward the building. "Inside. Comfortable. We're not animals." He paused. "The boy, too." Ridge's jaw set. "The boy has nothing to do with this." "The boy showed up," Rennick said simply. "His father sent him with a message." "Which I thought was an interesting choice, sending a 12-year-old as your messenger, but I've learned not to judge how desperate men operate." He pulled one hand out of his pocket and looked at something on his wrist. Not a watch. A gesture. "You know why you're here." "Gavin Mercer's debt," Ridge said. "Gavin Mercer's debt," Rennick confirmed. "Which is, at this point, not really about Gavin Mercer anymore. It became about you the moment your people started parking on his street." He looked at Ridge with the flat attention of the deeply unsentimental. "You made it your business, so now it's your business. That's how it works." "How much to end it?" Ridge said. Rennick smiled, which didn't reach the arithmetic eyes. "I don't want money, Calloway." The cold settled more deeply into the space between them. "I want the Mercer lease terminated," Rennick said, "which I can do legally within 30 days under the terms of the rental agreement, which Gavin signed without reading closely enough. I want him and the boy out of that house by the 15th, and I want your chapter to step back from the Mill District." He paused. "I have a development project, 4 blocks. It requires the current residents to find alternative accommodation. Your people have been making that conversation difficult." Ridge looked at him. "You're not talking about debt collection." "I was never talking about debt collection," Rennick said pleasantly. "The debt is a mechanism. I'm talking about a 240-unit mixed-use development with a projected return of—" He stopped himself. "The numbers aren't your concern. Your concern is simple. Tell your people to stand down. Let the Mill District development proceed. And Gavin Mercer's debt disappears. His family stays housed somewhere appropriate that I will arrange, and your friend inside goes home with a headache and a story to tell." Ridge stood very still. The wind moved through the fence line. One of the 3 men near the dock shifted his weight. "And if I say no," Ridge said, "then I foreclose on every rental property I own in the Mill District simultaneously," Rennick said, "which is 11 properties, 32 families. I have the legal right, and I have the paperwork ready, and I can trigger it with a phone call." He looked at Ridge steadily. "I'm not threatening you, Calloway. I'm showing you the arithmetic. You're good at arithmetic. Do the math." Ridge did the math. It took approximately 4 seconds, and it landed in his chest like cold water. 11 properties, 32 families. The Mill District residents who had been holding on through 3 bad winters, who had nowhere else in Harlow County they could afford, who had no vehicles in half the cases to get to the next county over, where rents were equally impossible. 32 families displaced in November, in below-freezing temperatures, through entirely legal process that the Black Wolves had no mechanism to challenge or block, against 1 man, 1 veteran, 1 boy, 1 debt. "You've been building toward this," Ridge said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was recognition." "Since last spring," Rennick confirmed, "when your chapter started making noise about the development proposal. I prefer to solve problems upstream." He pulled his other hand out of his pocket. "I'm not unreasonable, Calloway. This is a business arrangement. I need the board cleared. You clear the board, everybody goes home." Ridge looked at the building, at the broken clear-story windows, at the dark interior behind them where Cole was somewhere, and where Kellen Mercer was somewhere. A 12-year-old with a composition book full of names and dates and the careful handwriting of a child trying to build evidence that love was real. "I want to see them," Ridge said, "Cole and the boy, before I agree to anything." Rennick considered. Then he nodded once and stepped back from the door. Underscore, 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 underscore. The inside of the building was colder than the outside, which was a specific kind of cold produced by metal structures that absorb the winter and then trap it, the walls radiating their stored chill back into the space. The floor was concrete, cracked in a pattern that suggested decades of freeze-thaw cycles, and the overhead lighting was a row of bare work lights on extension cords running to a generator in the corner that filled the space with a low diesel hum. Cole was seated on a wooden chair in the center of the floor, with his wrist zip-tied behind him and a cut above his left eye that had bled considerably and then clotted, a dark trail down his jaw and dried on the collar of his shirt. He was conscious, alert even. His eyes found Ridge the moment the loading dock door opened, and what moved through them was complicated. Relief and something else, something that looked like warning. Kellen was against the east wall, not restrained, sitting on an overturned plastic crate with his knees pulled up and his arms around them. He was pale, not panicked, past panic, into the particular stillness that comes when the body has been frightened for long enough that fear becomes a baseline rather than a spike. When he saw Ridge, something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who has been alone with a calculation they couldn't solve and has just been handed a new variable. "You okay?" Ridge said to Cole. "I'm outstanding," Cole said, which meant he wasn't, but he was functional, which was the information Ridge needed. Ridge looked at Kellen. "You hurt?" Kellen shook his head. His voice came out steady, which cost him something. "They just put me in here. Nobody touched me." He paused. "My dad sent me with a note. For Rennick." He pressed his lips together. "I didn't know it was going to be—" He stopped. "I know," Ridge said. "It's okay." It wasn't okay, but it was the right thing to say, and Kellen clearly understood both things simultaneously. Ridge turned to face Rennick, who had followed him inside with one of the three men from the dock, and stood now at a careful distance with his hands back in his pockets. "Release the boy," Ridge said. "Now. He walks out. He waits by my bike. That's not negotiable." Rennick looked at Ridge for a moment. Then he nodded to the man beside him, who crossed to the east wall and gestured for Kellen to stand. Kellen got up. He looked at Ridge. "Go outside," Ridge said. "Sit by the bike. Don't go anywhere." "What about, I'll get Cole. Go." Kellen went. The loading dock door opened and closed behind him, and the diesel hum of the generator seemed louder in his absence. Ridge turned back to Rennick. "Cut Cole loose when we have an agreement." "We don't have an agreement," Ridge said. "We have a conversation. Cut him loose or the conversation ends." Something shifted very briefly in Rennick's arithmetic eyes. He was recalculating. Ridge was not behaving like a man who understood that he was the one without leverage here, and that either meant Ridge was foolish or Ridge knew something Rennick didn't, and Rennick had not survived in his particular business by assuming his opponents were foolish. He nodded again. The man with him produced a blade and cut the zip ties, and Cole rolled his wrists forward slowly and stood up from the chair, and did not move toward the door, which told Ridge something about Cole that he already knew and was glad to be confirmed. "Here's my answer," Ridge said to Rennick. "No." Rennick's expression didn't change. "Then I make the call." "Make it," Ridge said. "And tomorrow morning I go to the county assessor's office and I file a complaint about the zoning documentation for the Fletcher Road parcel, which I've had looked at by two attorneys who both have opinions about the accuracy of the survey markers. And I send a copy of the rental agreement, Gavin Mercer's, to the tenant advocacy organization in the state capitol, where I know someone who handles predatory lending cases involving veteran borrowers. And I call the journalist at the Harlow Courier who has been trying to reach me for 3 months about this development, and I give her everything I have, which is more than she's been able to get on her own." He paused. "And I do all of that in the next 24 hours, which is not enough time for you to make 32 evictions disappear." The generator hummed. The work lights made everyone's face look slightly jaundiced. Rennick looked at Ridge for a long time. "You've been preparing for this," he said. "Since last spring," Ridge said. Same words Rennick had used, same tone. Something moved through Rennick's expression that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. The particular response of a man who recognizes in another man's preparation the mirror of his own. He pulled one hand from his pocket. He looked at it. "You're protecting one family," he said, "against 32. "I'm protecting 32, Ridge said. "The one family is where it started. The 32 is why it matters." He looked at Rennick steadily. "Call your lawyers. Get them on the phone right now. Ask them how long a contested zoning challenge delays a project's construction timeline. Ask them what predatory lending documentation does to a development company's relationship with county lenders. Ask them." He paused. "Then do the math." The silence held for 15 seconds, which was long enough to mean something. Then Rennick put his hand back in his pocket. He looked at Ridge with the eyes that were always calculating and said, "This isn't finished." "I know," Ridge said, "but it's finished tonight." He turned to Cole. Cole was already moving toward the door. Underscore, 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 underscore. Outside, the cold hit differently after the trapped chill of the building. Cleaner, moving, the cold of open space rather than enclosed metal. Kellen was at the bike as instructed, sitting on the gravel with his back against the rear wheel and his knees up. He stood when he saw Cole come out behind Ridge, and when he saw the dried blood on Cole's jaw, his face did something complicated that he controlled quickly, the way he controlled most things quickly. "Is it over?" he said. "For tonight," Ridge said. He got on the bike. "Cole, can you ride?" "I can ride," Cole said. He could ride. Ridge had his doubts, but Cole was already moving toward the salvage yard where, he said, his bike was parked. They'd intercepted him before he got to Caldwell Street. Two of Rennick's people in the beige Camry that had cased the house 6 days ago run him to the shoulder on the Mill Road and suggested very directly that he accompany them. His phone had come out of his pocket in the car, and he'd managed to get it onto the seat before they walked him in. "Smart," Ridge said. "I've been picked up before," Cole said flatly. "You learn to leave a trail." Kellen was on the back of Ridge's bike, which was not a thing Ridge normally did, but which was the only option. And Ridge felt the boy's arms around his waist, and the specific way a child holds on, differently than an adult, less self-conscious about the grip, more completely committed to it. And he rode back down the gravel track toward the salvage yard and the road and the amber-lit streets of Harlow with that weight at his back and the night air pressing cold against both of them. He was 3 blocks from Caldwell Street when his phone buzzed in his jacket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. And a third time. He pulled over under a streetlight and read the messages. The first was from Decker. "Gavin's, here at Fletcher. Came in on foot 20 minutes ago. Something's wrong with him." The second was from Hatch, 30 seconds later. "Get here, now." The third was from a number Ridge didn't recognize. A photograph. He looked at it for a long moment in the sodium orange light, with Kellen still on the bike behind him and Cole pulled up alongside. The photograph was of a document, a page from a legal file, the header identifying it as belonging to a county court proceeding from 11 years ago. Ridge read the top third of it and then stopped and read it again, more slowly, because the first reading had produced something in his chest that felt like the ground shifting, and he wanted to make sure he was reading it correctly before he let himself respond to it. He was reading it correctly. "What?" Cole said. He'd seen Ridge's face. Ridge handed him the phone. Cole read it. His own expression went through several stages in quick succession. Disbelief, then a particular cold comprehension, then something that was very close to anger but was sitting on top of something worse. "Who sent this?" Cole said. "I don't know," Ridge said. "This means—" "I know what it means." "Ridge." Cole's voice was low and very careful. "This means Rennick didn't find Gavin through the short-term loan circuit. He found him because he was already—" He stopped, looked at the phone again. He's been watching this family for 11 years. The document in the photograph was a custody proceeding record, 11 years old. The petitioner was a woman named Sandra Crane, listed as maternal aunt, seeking emergency guardianship of a minor child, Kellen James Mercer, age 1, on the grounds of parental incapacity. The respondent was Gavin Dale Mercer. And the attorney of record for the petitioner, the name in the upper right corner of the document, the name Ridge had not been expecting, the name that changed the geometry of everything, was a firm called Rennick and Associates, LLC, before Doyle Rennick had moved into property development back when he had been, in another life, a family law attorney. Rennick had tried to take Kellen when the boy was 1 year old, had failed, had spent the subsequent decade building the financial and legal infrastructure to try again through different means: property, debt, displacement, the slow, patient suffocation of a family's options until the father had nowhere left to stand. This was never about money. This was never about the Mill District. This was about a grudge 11 years old, carried by a man with the patience and resources to let it compound like interest. And Ridge had walked into the middle of it with his chapter behind him and a family's trust in his hands. And he had been running the wrong equation the entire time, because he hadn't known the variable that changed everything. He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at the road ahead. Behind him, Kellen's arms were still around his waist, the boy who was the center of something neither of them had understood was happening. And Ridge made himself breathe slowly and completely before he spoke. "Cole," he said, "right ahead to Fletcher. Don't tell Gavin anything yet." "What are you going to do?" Ridge looked at the road. "I'm going to find out who sent that photograph," he said, "because whoever it was had access to a sealed family court record, and that means someone inside Rennick's operation just decided to switch sides." He paused. "Or someone inside ours has been playing both." Cole looked at him for a moment with the particular stillness that came before something irreversible. Then he rode ahead, and Ridge sat under the streetlight with the cold coming down and Kellen's grip around his waist, and thought about the moment in Rennick's building when the man had said this isn't finished, not as a threat, Ridge now understood, but as a statement of fact about something much older and much deeper than a rent dispute or a development project or a veteran's debt. He started the engine. He rode toward Fletcher Road, toward Gavin Mercer, who was waiting in the clubhouse, not knowing that the thing hunting his family had been hunting them since before his son could walk, toward the sealed room in the back of his own mind, where he kept the decisions that cost something real to make. And he understood with cold and total clarity that what happened in the next 12 hours would determine whether the Black Wolves could protect this family or whether they had, without knowing it, been the mechanism by which Rennick had finally gotten close enough to finish what he'd started 11 years ago. The engine's roar split the cold night air, and Kellen held on, and Ridge rode hard into the dark toward the only thing left that mattered: the truth about who had sent that photograph, and whether it was a lifeline or the most elegant trap Doyle Rennick had ever set. Fletcher Road at 10:47 at night looked like a different address than it did in daylight. The clubhouse was lit from inside, the roll-up door up a third of the way, warm yellow light spilling out across the gravel forecourt in a wedge that made the surrounding dark look denser by contrast. 4 bikes were outside. Another 2 were visible inside, parked along the workshop wall beside the half-rebuilt Sportster that Kellen had held a flashlight over what felt like a different era ago. The generator was running. Somewhere inside, someone had a radio on low. Country, the old kind, the kind with steel guitar and real grief in it, and it mixed with the smell of oil and cold metal and fresh coffee coming from the direction of the small back room that served as the chapter's kitchen. Ridge pulled into the forecourt and killed the engine. Kellen was off the bike before it fully stopped, both feet on the gravel, a boy recalibrating quickly to solid ground after 20 minutes on a motorcycle in the cold. His face was composed in the particular way his face had been composed since the agricultural building, the mask of a child who has decided that feeling things will have to wait until he knows it's safe to. Gavin Mercer was inside. He was standing at the workbench along the south wall with his back to the door when Ridge came in, and he turned around when he heard boots on concrete, and his expression when he saw Kellen went through 3 stages in approximately 1 second. Relief. Then the complicated guilt of a parent who has just learned their child was in danger, as a direct consequence of the parents' problems, then a controlled stillness that was the adult version of the same mask Kellen wore. Kellen crossed the workshop floor and stopped in front of his father, and Gavin put both hands on the boy's shoulders and looked at him for a long moment, checking him the way you check something you almost lost without yet knowing you'd lost it. "You're okay," Gavin said. It was not quite a question. "I'm okay," Kellen said. Gavin pulled him in, one arm around the back of his son's head, the boy's face against his chest, and Gavin stood there with his eyes closed for 3 seconds, which was long enough to mean everything, and short enough to maintain the particular form of dignity that men in front of other men maintain even when it costs them. Then he looked up at Ridge over Kellen's shoulder, and what was in his eyes was not gratitude. It was something harder than gratitude, something that had gratitude at its base, but had anger built over the top of it. The anger of a man who has just understood that he has been more of a pawn than a person in a game he didn't know he was playing. "We need to talk," Gavin said. "I know," Ridge said. "Not," he glanced at Kellen, "not right now." "I know that too," Ridge said. "Decker." Decker materialized from the direction of the kitchen with a mug of hot chocolate that he delivered to Kellen with the casual efficiency of a man who had been in enough situations to understand what children needed in the aftermath of fear, which was warmth and something to do with their hands. He steered Kellen toward the Sportster with a question about the carburetor that was almost certainly invented for the purpose, and Kellen followed, and within 90 seconds was seated on a stool, holding the mug in both hands and listening to Decker explain something about the fuel delivery system with the focused attention of a child who needed, desperately, something concrete to think about. Ridge took Gavin to the back room. Cole was already there, a bag of ice wrapped in a shop rag pressed against the cut above his eye, sitting at the small table with a coffee in front of him. Hatch was leaning against the far wall. Voss was in the corner, the oldest man in the room, and somehow the most still, watching everything with the patience of someone who had seen enough versions of this kind of conversation to know it needed to finish itself rather than be directed. Ridge put the phone on the table with the photograph open. He watched Gavin look at it. He watched Gavin go very still. "You've seen this document before," Ridge said. "I've seen it," Gavin said. His voice was flat. He set the phone down. He sat. He pressed his palms against the edge of the table and looked at the far wall. "Sandra dropped it. The custody petition. 6 weeks after she filed. I never knew why." He paused. "I thought she changed her mind. I thought she decided Kellen was better off with me, even with everything that was—" He stopped, pressed harder against the table. Kellen was one. His mother had just died. Sandra was her sister. I thought it was grief making her do it, and then grief making her stop. "Rennick withdrew her petition," Ridge said. "According to whoever sent that photograph, he convinced her the case was weak and that pursuing it would damage her relationship with you permanently. He told her to stand down." "Why?" Gavin said, not asking, processing. "Because he wanted to keep the leverage for himself," Ridge said. "A withdrawn petition means the file exists, but it's sealed, which means he has documentation of a moment when you were at your lowest, when your wife had just died, and you were barely functional and a family member went to court, and you don't have access to it, but he does. It's a card. He's been holding it for 11 years, waiting for the right moment to play it." Gavin's throat moved. "The debt," Ridge continued, "the property, the eviction process. None of that was the end game. The end game was getting you financially and legally cornered to the point where he could surface the old petition, argue ongoing parental incapacity, and go back to family court with 11 years of compounded evidence." He paused. "A veteran with documented financial crisis, a history of mental health struggle, a sealed prior custody petition, and a recent incident involving—" "Stop," Gavin said, quiet, very controlled. The room held itself. "He was going to try to take Kellen," Gavin said. "Yes," Ridge said. "Through the courts. Legally. Cleanly. In a way that would be very difficult to fight without money or a very specific kind of documentation that most people don't have." Ridge looked at him directly. "He has property law, family law, and a county commissioner in his pocket, according to our information. He's been building the case file while building the debt. They were always the same project. Gavin looked at his hands on the table. He looked at them for a long time. "Who sent the photograph?" he said. "We're working on that," Hatch said from the wall. His voice was matter-of-fact, not evasive. Working on it meant exactly what it said. Someone was actively on it. "Because it matters," Gavin said. "If someone inside Rennick's operation sent that, then either they're switching sides," Ridge said, "or Rennick is using them to feed us information that looks like exposure, but is actually bait." He looked at Cole. "Which is why we're not moving until we know which one it is." Cole put the ice bag down. The cut had stopped seeping. It had left a dark stain along his jaw that the overhead light made look worse than it was. "I heard something in the building," he said, "before you came in. 2 of Rennick's men near the back. I couldn't get all of it, but one of them said a name." He paused. "Nolan." The room temperature did not physically change, but the quality of attention in it did. Hatch straightened off the wall. Ridge looked at Cole very carefully. "Say it again." "Nolan," Cole said. "The name they used was Nolan. In the context of—" he chose his words. "In the context of someone who had provided information about our chapter, about what we knew and when we moved." Voss in the corner let out a breath that was barely audible. Nolan was a prospect. 23 years old, 3 months into his probationary period with the chapter, brought in on Decker's recommendation after 2 years working the garage on Fletcher Road as a civilian mechanic. He was good with engines and better with silence, and he had a quality of careful usefulness that the chapter valued. He was at this moment in the main workshop area of the clubhouse with Decker and Kellen and a half-rebuilt Sportster. Ridge stood up from the table slowly. The way you stand when you're being deliberate about not communicating what you're feeling through your body because your body wants to communicate it very loudly. "Does Decker know?" he said. "Decker brought him in," Hatch said. "That's not what I asked." "No," Hatch said. "Decker doesn't know." Ridge looked at the door that separated the back room from the workshop. Through it came the low sound of the radio and the faint clink of a wrench and Decker's voice saying something patient and technical, the voice of a man teaching. "Gavin," Ridge said, "stay here." He went through the door. Underscore, 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 underscore. The workshop looked exactly as it had. Decker was at the Sportster, one knee on the floor, demonstrating something about the primary chain. Kellen was on his stool with the hot chocolate, watching. Nolan was at the far workbench with his back to the room, doing something with a parts tray that involved a great deal of concentrated attention. Ridge crossed the floor at a pace that was normal. He stopped at the workbench beside Nolan. "Hey," Nolan said without turning. He was arranging small components in the tray with the care of someone who needed to account for all of them. "Put that down," Ridge said. Something in the quality of Ridge's voice made Kellen look up from the stool, made Decker's hands go still on the chain, made the radio seem louder. Nolan put the tray down. He turned around slowly. He was a young man, 23, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was still working out what it was going to settle into. Right now it was working through the specific set of expressions that cycle through a person when they have been doing something they know is wrong and have just heard a tone of voice that tells them the time for not being caught is over. "Ridge," he started. "Don't," Ridge said. One word. Nolan closed his mouth. "Outside," Ridge said. They went outside. The cold hit immediately. The forecourt gravel under the sodium light, the line of bikes, the hard sky with its cold stars. Decker came out behind them, and Ridge heard the shift in Decker's breathing when he processed the geometry of what he was seeing. The way Ridge was standing. The way Nolan was standing. The 6 feet between them that was not a casual distance. "Tell me it's not what it looks like," Decker said. Nobody answered him. Ridge looked at Nolan. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, which was a thing he did when he needed to be sure his hands communicated nothing while his face communicated everything. "How long?" Ridge said. Nolan looked at the gravel. He was doing his own arithmetic. The kind where none of the numbers come out right, but you have to try them all before you accept the answer. 4 months, he said. Decker made a sound like something tearing. Before you prospected, Ridge said. Yes. Rennick came to you. His people did, at the garage, before... Nolan's jaw tightened. Before I asked Decker about prospecting. It wasn't... He stopped, tried again. It wasn't about the club, at the beginning. They just wanted to know about the Mill District properties. Who was living where? Which families were having problems? Simple information. I didn't think... You didn't think, Ridge said flat. I needed... Nolan pressed his hand against his sternum. My mother. She's in one of the Rennick properties, on Anderson Court. He told me if I helped him, he'd lock her rent for 3 years. That she wouldn't be part of the displacement. His voice had gone tight. I know how it sounds. It sounds like exactly what it is, Hatch said from the door. He had come out without Ridge noticing, which meant Cole had told him, which meant the information had moved through the back room faster than Ridge had expected. What did you give them? Ridge said. Specifically. Nolan looked at him. His eyes were doing the thing eyes do when the person behind them is trying to hold themselves together through the specific and terrible experience of being seen completely. The watch schedule on Caldwell Street. Which nights? Which brothers? The layout of your communications and that you used phone calls, not texts, for operational stuff. He swallowed. And he stopped. Finish it, Ridge said. The photograph, Nolan said. I sent the photograph. The forecourt went completely still. Cole appeared in the roll-up door behind Hatch. His face ran through something and settled. You sent it, Ridge said. I took a photograph of the document in Rennick's office 3 weeks ago when I was doing an oil change on his truck, Nolan said. I've been carrying it. I didn't know what to do with it. Tonight, when his people picked up Cole, when I found out the kid was being used, he shook his head. I sent it. I know it doesn't. He pressed his lips together. I know it doesn't make anything right. Decker was standing very still with his arms at his sides, and the particular quality of his stillness was the stillness of a large man managing something enormous at very close range. He had brought Nolan in. He had vouched for him. He had put his name on the prospect, which in the chapter's culture meant something that went beyond institutional process into the personal. Deck, Ridge said. I'm fine, Decker said, in a voice that made it clear he was not fine, but that fine was not what was required of him right now. Ridge looked at Nolan for a long moment. The young man held it. Whatever else was true about him, whatever the calculation had been, whatever the fear for his mother had overridden, he held Ridge's eyes, which was a form of accounting that Ridge noted. Your mother's on Anderson Court, Ridge said. Yes. What unit? 14. Ridge looked at Hatch. Hatch was already pulling out his phone. The photograph you sent us, Ridge continued, gives us the leverage to stop the displacement on every Rennick property in the Mill District, including Anderson Court. He paused. You know that. I figured it might, Nolan said quietly. You also gave Rennick our watch schedule, Ridge said, which is how he knew Cole was coming alone, which is why Cole's got a cut on his face and a 12-year-old spent 2 hours in a cold building because the person who was supposed to be watching Caldwell Street didn't show up the way Rennick knew he would show up. He kept his voice level. That's the math, both sides of it. Nolan nodded. He didn't look away. Go home, Ridge said. Nolan blinked. What? Go home tonight. Don't prospect. Don't come to the garage. Stay available. We're going to deal with Rennick first, and then I'm going to come find you. And when I do, you're going to answer every question I have completely, and then we'll decide where things stand. He looked at him steadily. You understand? Yes, Nolan said. Your mother's not losing her apartment, Ridge said. That was never on you to prevent. That was on us to fix, and we're going to fix it, but not because of anything you did, because it's right. Nolan stood in the forecourt in the cold and looked at Ridge for a moment with an expression that was too complicated to name and went inside to get his jacket. Decker watched him go. Then he looked at Ridge. You let him walk, Decker said. For now, Ridge said. "He put coal in that building." "He also gave us the only piece of information we didn't have," Ridge said. "And he gave it to us when it cost him something." He looked at the road, at the dark beyond the sodium light's reach. "I'm not finished being angry about it, but anger's not what tonight needs." Decker was quiet for a moment. "What does tonight need?" Ridge looked at him. "Everything we have," he said. "All of it, because Rennick's not going to wait for morning." Underscore, 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 underscore. He was right. Hatch's phone rang at 11:20. He listened for 45 seconds, said 2 words, and hung up. He looked at Ridge. "Rennick filed the emergency family court petition," he said. "Tonight, an hour ago. His attorney called in a favor with a night-duty family court judge. The petition cites documented financial instability, a prior sealed custody proceeding, and—" he paused, "and a recent incident placing the minor in an unsupervised dangerous situation." The agricultural building. Kellen, in the building. Rennick had used his own action as evidence against the father of the child he'd put there. The elegance of it was nauseating. "He's got a temporary emergency custody order," Hatch said, "effective 6 a.m. Ridge checked the time. 6 hours and change. Gavin was in the doorway of the back room, he had heard. His face was the face of a man who has just felt the floor give way beneath him, and is still standing through nothing but the body's refusal to accept it yet. "How?" he said. His voice came from somewhere very quiet. "I don't understand how that's—" "Because the system he's using is the same system that failed you at the VA and failed you at the bank and failed you at the County Resource Center," Ridge said. "It's the same map. He knows where the gaps are because he helped build them." He crossed to Gavin. He stood in front of him and spoke clearly, close enough that it couldn't be misheard. "This is not over. You hear me. This is not done." "Ridge," Gavin's voice had fractured at the edge. "He can take my son." "Not by 6 a.m. he can't," Ridge said. "Because by 6 a.m. we're going to have documentation in the hands of an attorney who can challenge that order in front of a different judge. And we're going to have the predatory lending file submitted to the state. And we're going to have Rennick's name connected to the sealed custody record in a context that no family court judge in this state is going to ignore." He held Gavin's eyes. "But I need you to hold on for 6 hours. 6 hours. Can you do that?" Gavin looked at him. His jaw worked. Something moved through his face. All the months of wait, the nights at the kitchen table, the cold coffee, the empty bottle, and he pressed his fist against his sternum, hard once, and nodded. "What do you need from me?" Gavin said. "Every document you have," Ridge said. "Everything. The loan agreement, the lease, the VA correspondence, the denial letters, everything. If it's at the house, we're going to the house right now." He turned. "Hatch, get Marcus on the phone. I don't care what time it is." Marcus Teal was the attorney who had looked at Rennick's zoning documents in the spring. He was also a veteran. He was also a man who had been having a drink at the Black Wolves clubhouse on a Thursday evening 12 years ago, when a 19-year-old Ridge Calloway had come through the door looking for something he couldn't name, which was how a friendship began that had outlasted 3 of Marcus's legal partnerships and most of Ridge's original chapter roster. Hatch was already dialing. Ridge went back to the workshop. Kellen was still on the stool. The hot chocolate was long gone. He was looking at the Sportster but not seeing it, his mind clearly somewhere else, doing the thing his mind did. Cataloging, recording, building the map. Ridge crouched in front of the stool so they were at the same level. "Kellen," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." Kellen looked at him with the direct, undefended focus that Ridge had come to understand was simply who this boy was. Not performance, not effort. Just the genuine attention of someone who had learned early that information was survival, Ridge told him. He kept it factual and he kept it complete, because Kellen deserved both, and because the boy had already demonstrated that he could hold hard information without breaking under it. He told him about the petition, about Rennick's history, about the 6 a.m. timeline. He told him that it was not going to happen, and he told him exactly what they were going to do in the next 6 hours to make sure it didn't happen. And he told him that his father knew, and that his father was still standing. Kellen listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. His hands were flat on his thighs, and his breathing was slow and controlled, and he sat very still the way he sat when he was processing something large. When Ridge finished, Kellen said, "The toolbox." Ridge looked at him. "The composition book is in the toolbox," Kellen said. "At the house. Dad keeps it locked. It has every name, every date, every night." He looked at Ridge with the clarity of someone who has suddenly seen how a piece fits. "That's documentation, isn't it? Every night someone was there, every time someone showed up. That's a record that someone was looking after us, that a family was being cared for." He paused. "That's the opposite of what Rennick's trying to say." Ridge looked at him. At the 12-year-old who had ridden a bicycle through the dark to save his father, who had held a flashlight in the cold, who had sat in a frightening building and come out steady, who had spent weeks building a record of human decency because some part of him had known it might someday need to be proved. "Yeah," Ridge said, "that's exactly what it is." He stood. He pulled out his phone. He looked at the time, 11:31, 409 minutes until 6 a.m. From the back room, Hatch's voice, "Marcus is on." From the forecourt, the sound of 2 more Harleys pulling in. Voss and another chapter member, Bishop, who had gotten the call from Cole and come without being told what for, because that was how it worked, because that was what the chapter was. From the workshop doorway, Gavin Mercer standing with his son beside him, one hand on Kellen's shoulder, both of them looking at Ridge with the particular expression of people who have run out of options and have placed everything they have left in the hands of the only people still standing. Ridge looked at all of it, the workshop, the bikes, the men, the father and son, the 409 minutes. He put the phone to his ear. "Marcus," he said, "I need everything you've got." And in the courthouse across town, in a filing system that was already processing Rennick's emergency petition through channels that had been carefully arranged over years of patient institutional manipulation, a clock was running that neither Ridge nor his chapter nor every favor and document and decade of loyalty at their disposal might be enough to stop. And Ridge Calloway, who had survived war and addiction and loss and the particular slow violence of watching a community suffocate, who had sat in his own dark kitchen on his own version of the night they'd found Gavin, felt for the first time in 20 years something that was very close to fear, because what was at stake in the next 6 hours was not a battle he could ride into or a threat he could face directly, but a system. And systems did not have eyes you could look into or ground you could hold. And the boy on the stool behind him had a father who was still standing by the thinnest of margins. And Ridge had made a promise in a kitchen on Caldwell Street that he was not going to let himself examine too closely right now because examining it would cost him the clarity he needed. And what he needed right now, more than anything he had needed in a very long time, was to be exactly as capable as he had told a desperate man he was going to be. Marcus Teal arrived at the Fletcher Road Clubhouse at 12:14 in the morning in a 10-year-old Volvo with a cracked windshield and a back seat buried under case files, and he came through the roll-up door already talking. He was 61 years old, Marcus, a compact man with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that came from decades of standing in front of people who held power and refusing to be made smaller by it. He'd served 2 years in the Marine Corps before law school and wore that history the same way Ridge wore his cut. Not displayed, exactly, but present in the way he moved and the way he went quiet before he spoke and the way he made eye contact with Gavin Mercer across the cluttered workshop and said, "Show me everything," before he'd even put his briefcase down. They worked on the folding table in the back room. Marcus spread Gavin's documents across it. The loan agreement with Rennick's property company. The lease. 14 months of VA correspondence. 6 denial letters with their bureaucratic language that managed to communicate rejection without once using a word that felt human. 2 letters from the County Resource Center. Kellen's composition notebook. And the photograph of the sealed family court document that Nolan had taken in Rennick's office 3 weeks ago. Marcus read everything in order. He didn't comment while he read. He made notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting that was nearly illegible, the shorthand of a man who wrote only for himself during the intake phase. Ridge stood against the wall and watched him and didn't interrupt, because he had enough history with Marcus to know that interrupting the read was how you got incomplete analysis. Gavin sat at the table across from Marcus. His hands were flat on the surface again, the way they'd been in his own kitchen the night this started, as if the table were something he needed to hold on to in order to stay level. Kellen was in the workshop with Decker, ostensibly helping with the Sportster, actually within earshot through the half-open door, which Ridge had decided was acceptable. The boy had earned the right to hear this. Marcus set his pen down. He looked at the photograph of the court document. "This is sealed," he said. "I know," Ridge said. "The way we have it is not ideal from an evidentiary standpoint." "I know that too. But the content," Marcus tapped the photograph with one finger. "The content establishes a pattern of conduct by Rennick going back 11 years. Predatory targeting of a vulnerable family. Suppression of third-party intervention, the ant, to preserve his own leverage. And subsequent construction of financial dependency through a loan product that meets the statutory definition of predatory lending under the Veterans Protection Clause that the state legislature passed in 2019. He looked at Ridge. "Did you know about that clause?" "I knew it existed," Ridge said. "I didn't know how it applied." "Rennick knew," Marcus said. "He stopped issuing loan products under his own name in 2019. Everything after that runs through 3 shell companies. But the Mercer loan predates the statute, which means it falls under the 2019 amendment's retroactive provision for veteran borrowers." He picked up the pen again. Someone in his operation did not do their homework about the legislative calendar when they designed this. Or they did, and they decided the risk was acceptable. He paused. It wasn't. Gavin was watching Marcus with the concentrated attention of a man for whom these words were not legal theory, but the architecture of his son's future. "The emergency custody order," Gavin said. "Can you stop it?" Marcus looked at him directly. "I can challenge it. Tonight. There's a duty judge for family court emergency motions, different from the one Rennick used. And I can file a counter motion arguing procedural impropriety in the original filing, specifically the failure to notify the respondent prior to the emergency hearing, which is required under statute except in cases of imminent danger." He paused. "Rennick's petition argues imminent danger based on tonight's incident at the agricultural facility, the incident where your son was present in an unsupervised dangerous environment." The pause was deliberate. "Which is the environment Rennick created." "Can you prove he created it?" Ridge said. "I can document that the facility is a Rennick property," Marcus said. "I can document that the vehicle used to intercept coal belongs to an employee of Rennick's property management company. I can document—" He picked up the composition notebook. "I can use this to establish that far from being an unsupervised child in a dangerous environment, Kellen Mercer has been under consistent, documented, community-based supervision and care for the past 3 weeks." He held the notebook up slightly. "This is a contemporaneous record. Dates, times, names, a 12-year-old's handwriting. In a legal proceeding about the welfare of that 12-year-old, this is—" He set it down carefully. "This is something." The back room was very quiet for a moment. "File the counter motion," Ridge said. "I'm already writing it," Marcus said and picked up his pen. Underscore, 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 underscore. The next 3 hours were the kind of hours that leave physical traces. Ridge drank 4 cups of coffee and felt none of them. Hatch made 2 calls to people whose names never came up in conversation, but whose information arrived in text messages that Hatch relayed to Marcus in clipped, precise language. Cole, his cut above the eye beginning to purple into a proper bruise, sat with his phone and worked a contact at the county assessor's office, a woman he'd helped through a landlord dispute 2 years earlier, who confirmed at 1:30 in the morning, on her personal phone, the ownership chain connecting Rennick's property company to the agricultural facility and 3 of the Mill District rental addresses. Voss, who had not said much since arriving, produced from his jacket pocket a business card for a journalist at the state capital's largest newspaper. Not the Harlow Courier, bigger than the Courier. and placed it on the table next to Marcus's legal pad without comment. Marcus looked at the card and placed it carefully in his briefcase. Gavin did not sleep. He sat in the back room for a while, and then moved to the workshop doorway and stood there watching Kellen, who had fallen asleep on the parts bench with his jacket folded under his head, his breathing slow and absolute, the sleep of someone whose body had decided it was owed this regardless of what the adults were doing. Decker was still there, sitting on an overturned crate nearby, not sleeping, not doing anything in particular except being present in the specific way Decker was present, large and quiet and unmovable. Gavin stood in the doorway and looked at his sleeping son for a long time. Ridge came to stand beside him. He had a mug of coffee he didn't offer to share, and he stood shoulder to shoulder with Gavin in the doorway, and they both looked at the boy. His mother, Gavin said quietly. She would have... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. She had this way of knowing what he needed before he said it, before he even knew. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone who has practiced saying difficult things without breaking in the middle of them. I've never been as good at that as she was. I keep thinking I should be better at it by now. 4 years is... He pressed his lips together. It doesn't get shorter. Ridge said nothing for a moment. He drank his coffee. No, he said finally. It doesn't get shorter. It gets different. That's not the same thing as easier. He looked at Kellen's sleeping face. But he rode his bicycle 1.5 miles in the dark to save you. That kid knows exactly what he needs. And what he needs is you alive. He paused. You know that. I know it tonight, Gavin said. I didn't know it 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago you were alone, Ridge said. Now you're not. He looked at him sideways. Different arithmetic. Gavin was quiet. His breath came out slow in the cold that seeped through the roll-up door's gap. What do I owe you? He said. Not the money question. The deeper one. The one about debt that doesn't have a currency. Nothing, Ridge said. You don't owe us anything. That's not how the world works. It's how this works, Ridge said. We didn't come to your house to collect something, but we came because a kid asked us to, and because the situation was one we recognized, and because... He stopped. Because it's what you do. If you're able to and someone needs it. That's the whole philosophy. It's not complicated. Gavin looked at him. In the parts bench light, with the night outside and the workshop smelling of oil and metal and the cold that came through every gap in the corrugated walls, he looked like what he was. A man who had been taken apart by grief and financial violence and the specific kind of institutional abandonment that doesn't leave visible marks, but does leave damage, and who was slowly, in the dim, imperfect light of a motorcycle club's workshop at 2 a.m, beginning to look like someone who might be able to be put back together. Not the same, not restored. Something new, built from the same materials, but shaped differently. I want to tell you something, Gavin said, and I need you to just hear it. All right, Ridge said. I had the bottle that night because I had done the math, Gavin said. The real math. Every number. Every asset and liability. Every option I could see. He looked at the floor. I had decided that the numbers didn't work with me in them. That the liability side of Kellen's life was... He stopped. Steadied. I was wrong about the math. I was missing variables. But at the time, I had checked it 3 times, and I was certain. He looked up. I need you to know that. That it wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a considered conclusion, because I want you to understand how far in I was, and what it means that I'm standing here. Ridge held the silence carefully. He did not rush into it with comfort or reassurance, because Gavin had asked him to hear it, not to respond to it, and hearing something means letting it land before you say anything about it. I understand, Ridge said when the right amount of silence had passed, and I'm glad you're standing here. Gavin nodded once. He looked back at his son. Me too, he said, very quietly, like something he was still convincing himself of and almost had. Underscore, 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 underscore. Marcus filed the counter motion at 2:47 in the morning. He filed it electronically through the court's emergency portal, simultaneously emailing supporting documentation to the Family Court Duty Judge's chambers and to the Office of the State Attorney General's Veterans Affairs Division, where he had a contact who had been waiting, Marcus said, for a clean case to bring against Rennick's lending operation for the better part of 18 months. The duty judge responded at 4:03, a single paragraph. The emergency custody order was stayed pending a full hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. The stay meant that whatever Rennick had arranged for 6 a.m., and Ridge had spent 3 hours imagining the specific shape of it, the beige Camry on Caldwell Street, the legal paperwork, the particular violence of a child being removed from a father by a process designed to look like protection, was legally blocked, at least until 9. 6 hours had become 4 hours, and those 4 hours had been enough, barely, by the width of a margin that Ridge would think about for a long time afterward. Hatch read the judge's response from his phone and relayed it to the back room, and the sound that came from Gavin Mercer was not a word. It was not anything that had a name. It was the sound of a calculation being revised at the most fundamental level, the arithmetic of whether existing was worth it recalculating in the direction of yes, and it lasted about 3 seconds, and then Gavin pressed both hands over his face and held them there, and nobody in the room said anything, which was exactly right. Kellen slept through it. Decker in the workshop looked through the doorway at Gavin and then looked at the sleeping boy and put one large hand briefly on the bench beside Kellen's folded jacket, not touching him, just near him, and then went back to his quiet vigil. Underscore, 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 underscore. The 9 a.m. hearing lasted 4 hours. Ridge was not in the courtroom. The courtroom was Marcus's territory, and Marcus was precise about his territories. Ridge sat in the hallway outside on a bench that was designed to be uncomfortable, in his cut, which he had considered removing and then decided against, and Hatch sat beside him, and they drank bad coffee from a vending machine and said very little. Gavin was inside with Marcus. Kellen was with Cole at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse. Cole's idea, executed with the matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized Cole in all things, producing a booth and pancakes and orange juice and a nearly complete silence that Kellen, according to Cole later, had clearly needed more than conversation. The hearing was not clean. None of it was clean. Rennick's attorney was good, precise, prepared, the kind of practice that came from knowing the system's pressure points. And the family court judge was not one Marcus knew, and therefore not one whose particular priorities and blind spots he had been able to account for in advance. There were 3 recesses. There was a point, Marcus told Ridge afterward, where the judge had been clearly inclining toward Rennick's framing of the agricultural building incident, reading it as a pattern of parental negligence rather than as evidence of Rennick's manipulation, and Marcus had made the decision to enter the composition notebook into evidence and read from it aloud. Dates and times and names in a 12-year-old's handwriting, and the room had gone a particular kind of quiet that courtrooms go when something human enters them unexpectedly. The predatory lending documentation, with the Veterans Protection Clause analysis, was entered by Marcus as a motion to dismiss the petition on bad faith grounds. Rennick's attorney objected. The judge took 40 minutes in chambers and came back with a ruling that the petition had been filed in a context of manufactured crisis, citing the property company's documented connection to the agricultural facility and the timeline of the loan and the sealed custody record's connection to Rennick personally, and dismissed it with prejudice. With prejudice meant it could not be refiled. The same argument, the same petition, under the same bad faith conditions, was permanently closed. Marcus came out of the courtroom at 1:17 in the afternoon with his briefcase in one hand and his yellow legal pad under his arm, and he looked at Ridge on the bench and said, "Dismissed." Ridge stood up. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the courthouse hallway, the fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum, the bulletin boards with their flyers about legal aid services. "The lending case," he said. "State AG's office opens a formal investigation within 30 days, Marcus said. "Based on what I submitted last night, the Mill District properties, all 11 of them, are frozen from eviction action pending the investigation. Rennick can't move on any of them. He paused. It doesn't destroy him. He has other assets, other operations. But this specific project is finished, and he knows it. And Gavin's debt. Under the retroactive Veterans Protection Clause, the loan is void, Marcus said. Null. The interest is illegal. The principal structure is illegal. He doesn't owe Rennick $1. He looked at Ridge steadily. He never legally owed him $1. Ridge put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. He held it there for a moment, which was as much as either of them did in the way of demonstrative things. Send me your hours, Ridge said. I'll send you a bill, Marcus said, and then I'll write off 70% of it and dare you to argue with me. He started down the hallway. Tell the boy I said well done. The notebook was the difference. Underscore, 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 underscore. Cole's Diner was the kind of place that had been serving the same menu for 30 years and intended to serve it for 30 more. A long counter with spinning stools, 4 booths along the window, a pie case that was almost always half empty by mid-afternoon because the pies were genuinely good. It smelled of coffee and bacon grease and the particular warmth of a room that has been heated by people in cooking for decades and has absorbed all of it into the walls. Kellen was in the last booth with a glass of orange juice and the paper placemat, which he had covered with a drawing. Not a map this time, but something else. A shape that Ridge couldn't immediately identify when he slid into the booth across from the boy. Kellen looked up. He read Ridge's face. It's okay, he said, not asking, reading. It's okay, Ridge confirmed. Kellen looked at the placemat. He turned it slightly so Ridge could see. It was a drawing of a toolbox, the old steel one, the one from the shop space, the one that held the composition notebook. On the inside lid of the drawn toolbox, Kellen had written names. Not all of them. The placemat wasn't big enough, but a column of them, in the careful handwriting Ridge recognized. I'm going to make a real one, Kellen said. Not on paper, metal. In the shop. He looked at Ridge. Decker said he'd show me how to engrave. When did you decide that? Ridge said. Just now, Kellen said, while I was waiting. He looked at the drawing. I want it to be something that stays, not paper, something you'd have to work to damage. Ridge looked at the drawing, at the names in the column. He saw his own near the top, which Kellen had written first because that was the night it had started, the night the boy had ridden out into the dark and trusted the only door he could find. Cole arrived at the booth with a mug of coffee he set in front of Ridge without ceremony and slid in next to Kellen, leaving room for the placemat. Where's your dad? Kellen said. He's coming, Ridge said. Marcus had some paperwork. 20 minutes. Kellen nodded. He drank his orange juice. He looked out the diner window at the street. Harlow at 1:30 in the afternoon. Pale winter sun on the storefronts. A pickup at the light. 2 women talking on the sidewalk in front of the hardware store. Is it really done? He said. Not suspicious. Just checking the map. Rennick's finished with you, Ridge said. Both of you. Legally and financially finished. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. He's not done in the world. Men like that don't disappear. But he's done with your family. Kellen absorbed that. He looked at the placemat. He added one more name to the column, Marcus, and then set the pen down. Okay, he said. The word carried more weight than one syllable usually does. It was the okay of someone who has been holding something very heavy and has just been told they can put it down and is still deciding whether to believe the telling. Underscore, 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 underscore. Gavin came through the diner door at 1:58. He had the look of a man who had spent 4 hours in a courtroom doing the specific and exhausting work of having his life adjudicated by strangers and had come out the other side of it not victorious, or not exactly, but intact, which was a different and in some ways more durable thing than victory. He stopped inside the door. He looked at the booth at the back of the diner, at his son. Kellen looked back at him. Neither of them moved for a moment. The diner was doing its mid-afternoon business around them. The coffee, the counter, the pie case, and they were still in the middle of all of it, looking at each other, recalibrating the distance. Then Kellen got up from the booth and crossed the diner and put his arms around his father's waist, and Gavin put both arms around his son, and they stood in the entrance of a 30-year-old diner while the world moved around them. And this time, Gavin did not hold the sound in. It was quiet. It was very small. But it was there. Cole looked at the table. Ridge looked at his coffee. Even the counter seemed to find something else to be interested in. After a while, they came to the booth and sat, father and son on one side, and Gavin looked at Kellen's placemat and was quiet for a long time. "The notebook," he said. "Marcus used it," Ridge said. "It was entered into evidence. The judge heard it." Gavin looked at the column of names. He pressed his thumb against the paper, not hard, just present. "You made this record," he said to Kellen. "You kept showing up in the morning," Kellen said. "I just wrote it down." Gavin's throat moved. He looked at the placemat for a moment longer, then looked up at Ridge. "Thank you," he said. "Not inadequate. Sometimes those two words carry everything if they're said correctly, and Gavin said them correctly." "You're going to need some things," Ridge said. "Practically. The state investigation will resolve the lease. You can stay on Caldwell Street through the process and likely longer. The VA claim Marcus is connecting you with a veterans benefits specialist he knows. She has a success rate that I can't explain except to say she is apparently extremely difficult to say no to." He drank his coffee. "The Mill District families, all 32 of them, are protected for the duration of the investigation. Nobody loses their home." "Nolan's mother," Gavin said. He knew about Nolan by now. Ridge had told him briefly in the courthouse hallway because Gavin deserved to know. "Included," Ridge said. Gavin was quiet. He seemed to be thinking about Nolan, about the young man who had been frightened for his mother and had made wrong choices in response to that fear, and had then, at the cost of everything he'd built toward with the chapter, made a right one. Ridge had been thinking about Nolan since the forecourt, turning him over in his mind the way you turn something over when it's more complicated than you'd prefer. "What happens to him?" Gavin said. "He's out of the prospect period," Ridge said. "That's not something that comes back, but—" He paused. "He's still working the garage. Different terms. We're still figuring out what that looks like." Gavin nodded slowly. Not absolving, not condemning, just acknowledging the complexity, the way adults who have made their own desperate calculations in their own dark kitchens acknowledge it in others. Underscore, 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 underscore. 3 months later, the metal fabrication shop opened. It occupied a narrow storefront on Archer Street, 4 blocks from the Black Wolves Clubhouse on Fletcher Road, in a space that had been a locksmith's for 20 years before the locksmith retired, and left behind a solidly built interior that smelled of machine oil and metal filings, and required only minor renovation to become what Gavin and Kellen needed it to be. The sign above the door was hand-cut steel lettering, the first real project Kellen had completed in the shop, under Decker's instruction over 3 weekends in January, that read Mercer Metalworks in letters that were not perfectly even and were exactly right for that reason. The toolbox was inside. The old one, the steel one with the composition notebook on the inside lid, now joined by the metal-engraved panel Kellen had made, affixed to the same lid with 4 countersunk screws. The names transferred from paper to steel in letters that required a loop to read individually, but that caught the light when the lid was open and made the whole thing look like something that had always been meant to be permanent. The toolbox hung on the wall inside the shop beside a framed photograph. Hatch had taken it without telling anyone he was going to, the night of the counter motion filing, catching Gavin and Kellen at the diner's back booth before Ridge arrived. The boy asleep against his father's shoulder this time. Gavin awake, but still, his eyes somewhere between the table and a middle distance that might have been the past or the future or both. The photograph was not a proud image. It was not a triumphant one. It was a tired, honest, human image of a man and his son in a diner at 1 a.m. and it was the truest record of what had almost been lost and hadn't. The Porch Watch program was Ridge's idea, and the chapter's unanimous adoption. It had no formal name at first, and it was just the thing they did, sending people to sit with whoever needed it in the Mill District, the word passing through the neighborhood, the way reliable information passes in communities that have learned not to trust official channels. But after the third family asked what to call the men who showed up at their door with coffee and no agenda, it became the Porch Watch, and then it became the thing it was. Voss ran it, which suited him. He had the patience of someone who had been waiting his entire adult life for something useful to do with his particular quality of stillness. And he was precise about the logistics in the way that people who have spent time in organized systems are precise. And he was also genuinely, constitutionally incapable of making anyone feel like a charity case, which was the skill the program needed most. Cole became, unexpectedly, the person families called first. He was not warm in any conventional sense. He was spare and direct and economical with reassurance, in a way that some people found difficult. But he showed up exactly when he said he would, and he never said anything he didn't mean. And in communities where both of those things had been rare, they turned out to be more sustaining than warmth. Gavin joined the watch 6 weeks after the shop opened. He called Ridge on a Thursday evening and said he wanted to go with someone, learn how it worked. And Ridge sent Voss. And Gavin spent that Thursday on the porch of a man named Elton Crawford on the north end of Caldwell Street, who was 73 and had recently lost his wife and had not spoken to anyone outside a grocery store transaction in 11 days. Gavin sat on Elton's porch with a thermos of coffee and did not try to fix anything, and Elton talked about his wife for 2 hours in the way people talk about losses that are too large for consolation. And at some point around midnight, Gavin understood that this was what had been done for him, and why it had worked when the other things hadn't. Not the fixing, not the assessment, just the refusing to leave. And he sat with Elton Crawford until the old man fell asleep in his porch chair and then sat an hour longer to make sure the sleep held. He came every Thursday after that. Underscore, 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 underscore. On a Wednesday evening in late March, Ridge came into the Mercer Metalworks shop after closing and found Kellen at the workbench doing something precise with a piece of flat stock and a scribe, laying out lines for a cut. The shop was warm. Gavin had insisted on a good heating system, the first real investment, and smelled of metal and coffee from the pot that was apparently always on, a habit Gavin had transferred from the kitchen to the shop without conscious decision. Ridge stood and watched Kellen work for a moment before the boy noticed him. "Dad's in the back," Kellen said without looking up. He had developed the workshop awareness of someone who is genuinely engaged in physical making, the peripheral sense of the room that comes from learning to track multiple hazards simultaneously. "I know," Ridge said. "I'm not here for your dad." Kellen looked up then. He set the scribe down. "The engraving on the toolbox," Ridge said. "I've been meaning to ask you something about it." "What?" Ridge looked at the toolbox on the wall, at the metal panel inside the lid, visible from across the room when the lid was open, which it currently was. "You put your own name in the column," he said, "at the bottom." Kellen looked at the toolbox. "I was there," he said. "Every night I was there too." "I know," Ridge said. "So it counts," Kellen said. "Yeah," Ridge said. "It counts." Kellen looked at the toolbox for a moment, and then looked at Ridge with the direct, undefended attention that was simply the way he looked at the world, and Ridge looked back, and there was a quality to the silence between them that had nothing in it that needed filling. "Can I ask you something?" Kellen said. "Shoot." "The man who came and sat on your porch," Kellen said, "a long time ago. Do you know where he is now?" Ridge looked at the toolbox, at the light catching the engraved names. "He died," Ridge said. 8 years ago. Cancer." He paused. "But before that, he ran a program. Not the same as this one. Different town, different people. But the same idea." He looked at the light on the steel. "That program is still running. I checked a couple years back. Different people running it. Still going." Kellen was quiet for a moment, absorbing the particular sadness and logic of that. the way something can outlive the person who made it and continue doing what it was made to do. "Okay," he said. He picked the scribe back up. Ridge stood for a moment longer in the warm workshop with the smell of metal and coffee and the sound of the scribe against flat stock, marking lines for something that would be cut and shaped into whatever Kellen was building. Then he went to the back to find Gavin, and through the shop window, the March evening was doing what March evenings do in that part of the country, threatening warmth without quite delivering it, the sky holding on to winter, even as the light began to suggest otherwise. Outside on Archer Street, a Harley sat at the curb. Hatch, on his regular pass through the neighborhood, not watching anything specific, not assigned to anything, just present in the way the chapter had become present in this part of Harlow, a quiet, regular fact of the landscape. He sat on the parked bike with a coffee from somewhere and his eyes on the street, and when a woman came around the corner walking a dog, he nodded to her and she nodded back with the familiarity of someone who had gotten used to seeing him there, and the dog pulled toward the bike and sniffed at the wheel, and Hatch looked down at it with an expression that was as close to charmed as Hatch ever got, which was not very close, but was something. The street was ordinary, cold still, but with the edge taken off. A truck went by. The hardware store's light was on. From somewhere in the direction of Fletcher Road, so far off it was more felt than heard, an engine turned over and settled into idle, and then another, and then the sound faded into the general texture of the evening. Gavin came through the back of the shop and poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking if Ridge wanted one, because by now it was understood, and he handed one over and they stood at the work table looking at the plans spread across it, the current project, a set of custom brackets for the County Veterans Resource Center's new facility, a commission that had come in the previous month through a connection Marcus had made, which had led to 2 more commissions, which was how a small shop finds its footing. "How's Elton Crawford?" Ridge said. "Better," Gavin said. "His daughter came to visit last month. They'd been—" He paused. "They'd had a gap. Years. She came. I don't know exactly what happened, but he's been different since." He drank his coffee. "Lighter." "Good," Ridge said. They were quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they have come through something large together and are standing on the other side of it. And the other side turns out to be not paradise, but ordinary life, difficult and imperfect, and threaded through with grief, and also, quietly, with this: a warm shop, 2 mugs of coffee, work on the table, a kid at the workbench making something from flat stock. "I'm going to need to talk to someone," Gavin said. "A professional. About the—" He moved his jaw. The stuff that was underneath everything. That the debt and the isolation were sitting on top of. He looked at his coffee. "Marcus's Veterans Benefits contact gave me a name. A therapist. Also a vet." "Okay," Ridge said. "I'm telling you because—" Gavin paused. "Because you told me you sat on your own side of the table once. And I wanted you to know that I'm not going to wait 11 years to deal with what's underneath." He looked at Ridge directly. "I'm not going to make Kellen sit outside another door wondering." Ridge held his gaze. Something in his chest that had been held carefully for a long time released a small fraction of its tension. "Good," he said. "Just that." The workbench light caught the steel panel inside the toolbox lid, and the names in the engraving held the light for a moment. Ridge, Cole, Decker, Hatch, Voss, and others. And at the bottom, Kellen's own name, the boy who had understood that he was part of the record, that his showing up counted too. And outside on Archer Street, Hatch drank his coffee, and the dog finished investigating the Harley's wheel, and the woman walked on. And in the back room of a metal fabrication shop 4 blocks from a motorcycle clubhouse, a man and his son were both still here, which had not been certain 3 months ago, and was now, tentatively, the kind of thing you could stop checking and start building from. The engine on Fletcher Road idled once more, distant, and then went quiet. Not gone, just still, the way things are when they've decided to stay.